All right, today we are going to unpack one of the most important chapters in all of American history, the Civil Rights Movement. It is an absolutely powerful story about courage, about a massive, massive struggle, and in the end, a victory that literally changed the nation. But let's start with a big question. What does it actually take to change a nation? I mean, to really look at the laws, the culture, the very fabric of a country and say, you know what, this isn't right, and we're going to fix it. That's really the core question we're going to explore together today. Okay, so let's dive right in. To really get a handle on the movement, we first have to understand the problem it was trying to solve. For millions of African Americans, particularly in the South, the United States was, well, not so united. It was a country that was deeply and legally unequal. So here's the thing. Even after the Civil War ended slavery, and even with constitutional amendments promising equal rights, that promise was broken. It just didn't happen. Instead of equality, this whole new system of control popped up, using state and local laws, which you've probably heard of as Jim Crow laws. A huge part of this system was something called segregation. Just try to imagine this for a second. You go to school, and you see two water fountains right next to each other. One for white students, one for black students. That was the reality. It was this daily, in-your-face message that some citizens were considered less than others. Now, you might be asking, how was this inequality locked in place for so long? Well, it happened through something called disenfranchisement. I know, it's a big word, but it stands for a really simple and pretty terrible idea, taking away a person's fundamental right to vote. So how did they do it? Oh, they had a whole toolbox of unfair tactics. States would charge poll taxes, which were fees that many poor black citizens just couldn't afford. They'd use these completely impossible literacy tests. And if none of that worked, they resorted to threats, to people losing their jobs, and to outright violence just to keep people away from the ballot box. So here's the most important part. Faced with all of this injustice, people didn't just accept it. No way. They organized. They resisted. They built a movement, literally from the ground up, to demand the rights that they had been promised all along. And you know, we often hear about a few heroic figures, and they were absolutely heroic, but the real power of the movement, that came from thousands of ordinary people. We're talking students who walked out of their classes, teachers who organized voter drives in secret, and workers who risked their jobs, all for the cause of fairness. And they used these incredibly powerful, non-violent strategies to challenge the system. You had sit-ins, where incredibly brave students would just sit at whites-only lunch counters and peacefully refuse to leave. You had boycotts, where whole communities would stop using a service, like the city buses in Montgomery, to hit them where it hurts economically. And of course, through massive marches, they grabbed the attention of the whole country and the world. And all these tactics, they all came to a boiling point in a small town in Alabama called Selma. So in 1965, activists were focused on registering black voters there, and the response was brutal. After an activist, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was killed, a protest march was planned. On March 7th, as those marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were viciously attacked by police. This event, known as Bloody Sunday, was broadcast on TV all across the country, and people were absolutely shocked. And the impact of that broadcast was immediate. Just 8 days after Bloody Sunday, the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, went before Congress and the entire nation. He didn't just demand a new law to protect voting rights, he actually adopted the movement's own anthem, declaring, "And we shall overcome." I mean, that was a truly monumental shift. So how did all this build to something real? Well, the protests, the marches, that immense public pressure, it all led directly to landmark changes in American law. First up, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This thing was a massive deal. It made all those whites-only signs on restaurants and theaters totally illegal. It pushed hard for schools to finally integrate. And, so critically, it said you could not be hired or fired from a job simply because of who you are. Then, just 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came along and tackled disenfranchisement head-on. It was so direct. The problem was states were using tricks like literacy tests. The solution? Bam! The law banned them everywhere. The problem was local officials were just refusing to register black voters. The solution? The federal government sent its own people, federal examiners, to oversee registration and make sure it was done fairly. So, the big question, right? Did these new laws actually work? Well, let's look at the data, because the impact was immediate, and honestly, it was absolutely dramatic. Okay, just take the state of Mississippi. In 1964, before the Voting Rights Act was passed, only 6.7% of eligible African Americans were registered to vote. Just think about that number for a second. Now look at this. Just 4 years later, in 1969, that number had skyrocketed to 66.5%. That is a nearly 10 times increase. It's just unbelievable. And when you see it visually like this on a chart, the change is just stunning. That tiny little bar next to that massive one, this wasn't just a small step forward, folks. This was a giant leap. It fundamentally changed the political power of an entire community. And here's the crucial point. This legacy goes so far beyond just voting. With political power came more elected officials who actually represented their communities. It led to better funding for schools and public services, like paving streets in Black neighborhoods for the first time. And the success of the civil rights movement, it became a blueprint, inspiring so many other groups, women, Hispanic Americans, people with disabilities, to organize and fight for their own rights. And that brings us right back around to our big question. The laws passed back in the 1960s were a massive, nation-changing step, but the work continues. So I'm going to leave you with this to think about. More than 60 years later, what does the fight for equal rights look like? And what does it mean for your generation today?